Key U.S. allies are demanding the return of over $245 billion in gold reserves, while a global trend of pulling gold from America accelerates. Could the wave of massive gold withdrawals from U.S. reserves trigger a domino effect, forcing the interconnected links of the global financial system to restructure themselves? Germany and Italy, two of NATO's core allies, have formally requested the return of a staggering 3,600 metric tons of gold, currently held in the vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This gold is valued at roughly $245 billion. And interestingly, these nations are not asking for a simple bank, transfer, or digital adjustment. They want the physical gold, shipped home. This request follows new U.S. trade policies, with the Trump administration imposing tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum from Europe. European leaders are increasingly worried that the U.S. could leverage foreign gold as a geopolitical tool or a financial hostage if tensions escalate. According to the Wall Street Journal, this move is not just about finance. It's a powerful geopolitical signal. For everyday Americans, these gold withdrawals could shake global confidence in the U.S. financial system. If more countries follow suit, the U.S. dollar may weaken, driving up prices for consumer goods and pushing interest rates higher. Uncertainty over America's fiscal stability could impact savings, investments, and everyday costs, leaving many families to contend with higher living expenses and volatility in the markets. And it's not just Germany and Italy making moves. Other nations, and including Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, and Switzerland, are ramping up efforts to repatriate gold reserves from the US and London. A European Central Bank report from June 2025 found that gold now makes up 20% of global reserves, overtaking the euro at 16%. A recent survey cited by Reuters found that 40% of central banks plan to increase their gold holdings and reduce their exposure to the US dollar, reflecting mounting skepticism about the future role of the greenback. This worldwide gold movement is more than symbolic. As countries buy less US Treasury debt, the US government will face higher borrowing costs, potentially $85 billion, more per year in interest payments. This fiscal pressure could force lawmakers to consider cuts or freezes in vital areas like healthcare, education, and social security. And that could affect the long-term well-being of American families and retirees. A 2025 survey by the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, or OMFIF, shows that 60% of international reserve managers are seeking to diversify their portfolios and lessen their reliance on the US dollar. Instead of simply voicing concerns, central banks are voting with their vaults, swapping dollars for gold in record amounts. Even traditional allies like Germany and Italy are now pulling gold out of America, signaling a loss of faith in the once unquestioned security of U.S. financial assets. If this trust deficit grows, the dollar's value could fall further, leading to higher import costs and inflation. Rising interest rates may follow, making mortgages, car loans, and credit card debt more expensive. Market instability could threaten investments and retirement funds, while household budgets are stretched even thinner. The ripple effects from a weakened dollar could challenge the economic foundation that millions of Americans rely on. The world has endured catastrophic hyperinflation and soaring national debt, drawing chilling parallels to today. Could the U.S. be on the same risky path? In November 1923, Germany's paper mark collapsed to 4.2 trillion marks per U.S. dollar. Daily price hikes hit nearly 29,525%, forcing people to carry wheelbarrows of cash. A single loaf of bread reached 200 billion marks. Zimbabwe saw annual inflation spike to 98 billion% in November 2008, rendering local currency worthless and pushing citizens toward US dollars and South African rand. Venezuela experienced inflation rates in the millions of percent around 2018, triggering severe shortages of food and medicine, according to the IMF. Such uncontrolled money printing can obliterate savings and destabilize societies. If the US repeated this, everyday prices could spiral, wiping out middle-class wealth, and with it, trust in the financial system. American families could see their purchasing power disappear overnight, retirement funds eroded, and the costs of essentials, such as rent, food, healthcare, and transportation, rise so fast that even basic planning becomes impossible. Social unrest could follow, hitting the most vulnerable first on and hardest. Since the pandemic, the U.S. Federal Reserve has injected around $2.2 trillion via the CARES Act in March 2020. It further expanded fiscal stimulus, pushing deficits upwards. As of early 2025, U.S. national debt totals about $36.4 trillion, roughly 122% of GDP, increasing by approximately $1 trillion every 3 months. The IMF and Moody's have flagged this debt accumulation as a major financial risk. These policies helped avert a deeper recession and supported millions, but unchecked. Rising debt may drive up interest rates, raise taxes, and slash public spending on healthcare, education, and infrastructure. This would directly affect affordable loans, services, and quality of life for American households. Over time, families could struggle to secure home loans, small business owners may face higher borrowing costs, and local communities might see schools or hospitals underfunded. Everyday Americans could lose access to vital government support and feel the pressure in their wallets. The US dollar remains the world's primary reserve currency, underpinning global trade in commodities like oil, gold, and grain. During crises, such as the pandemic or geopolitical shocks, investors seek safety in the US dollar, boosting its value and helping control domestic inflation. A strong dollar reduces inflation risk and enables the US to borrow cheaply. However, maintaining this advantage depends entirely on sustaining global confidence in US policies and institutions. Global confidence in the dollar is crucial. No current rival, neither the Chinese yuan nor the euro, is seen as a viable replacement. But preserving that trust demands transparent, disciplined policy and debt management. If that trust erodes, US citizens could face surging prices for fuel and food, costlier mortgages, and heightened risk of economic slowdown or recession. Without a trusted dollar, everyday costs could skyrocket. Families might cut essential spending, while the economy could trend towards stagnation. It underscores that sound policy is everyone's personal concern. Major international airlines are cutting flights to the US, leaving travelers and local businesses facing growing challenges. What could this mean for everyday Americans who rely on these connections for work, travel, and economic stability? In recent months, a wave of major international airlines, including Play Airlines, Air Canada, Lufthansa, and Air France, have quietly pulled back on flights to the US. These carriers are increasingly shifting focus to Southeast Asian and European markets, where travel demand and profitability remain strong. According to a May 2025 report from Aviation Week, Air Canada has discontinued 5 key cross-border routes, connecting U.S. cities such as Detroit, Minneapolis, and Tampa to Canadian hubs. This shift is not isolated. Other major airlines are following suit. citing the U.S. market's high costs and uncertain returns. The impact is already being felt in U.S. airports, especially in local hubs like Buffalo, Tampa, and Seattle. The number of available seats on flights between the U.S. and Canada alone has dropped by an estimated 320,000 since January 2025, based on official data from Statista. With fewer international visitors, local businesses that rely on airport traffic, restaurants, taxis, and hotels are struggling to maintain profits. The U.S. Travel Association estimates domestic tourism and hospitality sectors could see losses of up to $8.5 billion in 2025 as declining international arrivals drain revenue from airports and surrounding communities. This pullback doesn't just inconvenience travelers. It undermines the economic backbone of dozens of cities across the country. Looking ahead, industry experts warn that unless these trends reverse, more local airports could see further reductions in international service. Smaller airports are at particular risk of losing their last remaining overseas connections, making it even harder for Americans to access global destinations and for foreign visitors to reach U.S. towns. This shrinking network may continue into 2026, further widening the gap between major travel hubs and the rest of the country. Local business owners, already struggling with reduced customer traffic, worry that if flight cuts continue, their livelihoods may be at risk, forcing some to shut down for good. Driving this wave of cutbacks is a new set of U.S. tariffs that have dramatically increased the cost of flying into and out of America. In early 2025, the U.S. government implemented new tariffs on imported aviation parts and components: 25% for goods from Canada and Mexico, 20% from China, and 10% from all other countries. Industry data from Reuters show that these increased costs have had an immediate impact, with Air Canada reporting a double-digit drop in U.S.-bound ticket bookings, down by 10 to 15% in the first half of 2025. These tariffs are forcing airlines to adjust their strategies. Air Canada is increasing domestic routes and adding flights to vacation spots in Mexico and the Caribbean. Lufthansa and Air France are also redirecting capacity to European and Asian markets, where tariff costs are lower and demand is more stable. For American consumers, this means international flight tickets to and from the U.S. are now more expensive and harder to find. The New York Times reports that the average cost of an international round-trip ticket to the U.S. has increased by 12% since the new tariffs took effect. Choices are shrinking, making it more difficult for Americans to travel abroad for business or leisure, and limiting the ability of foreign tourists to visit the U.S. for American businesses, especially those that depend on global partners or customers. Fewer direct flights and higher travel costs are making international deals more complicated and sometimes impossible. Looking forward, if tariffs remain high, analysts forecast even greater reductions in international flight options. Airlines may continue to cut U.S.-bound flights through 2026, and some may withdraw completely from smaller markets. This would mean continued pressure on ticket prices, less competition, and a widening gap between what Americans pay to travel and what travelers in other parts of the world experience. With fewer airlines competing, the risk of monopolies or price fixing increases, further hurting the wallets of American families and business travelers. Behind these immediate changes lies a more significant, long-term shift in the global aviation landscape. As the U.S. becomes a less attractive market, other regions, especially Southeast Asia, broader Asia, and the Middle East, are rising as new aviation hubs. Leading airlines like Vietnam Airlines and Singapore Airlines have expanded their international networks in 2025, adding new routes and increasing flight frequencies to key destinations. According to the International Air Transport Association, IATA, Southeast Asia has seen international passenger traffic jump by 19% in the first quarter of 2025, compared to the same period last year. Industry analysts warn that if the U.S. does not reconsider its trade and travel policies soon, it risks losing its long-held position as a central hub of global aviation. The phrase flyover zone, once used to describe parts of the U.S. seen only from 35,000 feet, may soon apply to the country as a whole. If airlines continue to bypass American airports in favor of Asian and Middle Eastern destinations. Projections from the Center for Aviation, CAPA, suggest that without a course correction, the U.S. could lose another 1.2 million international passenger arrivals in 2026, with corresponding losses in tourism, hospitality, and related industries. American workers stand to lose jobs in airport services, transportation, and retail, while consumers face even higher airfares and longer travel times. To maintain its standing, the U.S. will need to take decisive steps, reduce aviation tariffs, reopen key international routes, and make it easier for travelers to obtain visas and enter the country. Failing to act could see the U.S. not only lose economic competitiveness, but also fade from the global tourism and business landscape. Strong international connectivity has long been a source of American prosperity, and without timely action, this advantage could be lost to rising global rivals. Industry forecasts highlight a future where the U.S. could fall behind in global travel and business. If current trends persist, for Americans, the time to advocate for smarter policies and broader global engagement is now, before the world truly flies by. Across America, farm disruptions are affecting both rural livelihoods and family kitchens. What unexpected twists in America's farmlands could quietly reshape the price and quality of everyday groceries this year? In recent months, many farmers in Kansas have faced a tough decision: harvest their wheat at a loss or destroy the crop for insurance payouts. This dramatic move, reminiscent of the National Farmers Organization protests in the 1960s, signals deep distress in the heart of American agriculture. For ordinary Americans, these disruptions mean more than just news from farm country. When local wheat supply is interrupted, the cost of everyday staples like bread and breakfast cereals climbs. In May 2024, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the average retail price for bread rose by 8% compared to the previous year, reflecting increased costs passed directly onto shoppers. Grocery stores in the Midwest and on the East Coast have already reported periodic shortages of flour-based products. For families on a budget, each price hike makes it harder to stretch dollars at mealtime. Looking ahead, experts caution that if current trends continue, wheat prices could remain volatile for months. Without stable export contracts and improved insurance policies, many farmers may plant less wheat next season, deepening supply concerns into 2025. Consumers can expect higher bakery prices and reduced choices on grocery shelves if these issues persist. In Washington state, the heart of America's cherry country, a stunning 50% of harvest workers walked off the job just before picking season began, according to the Seattle Times. As a result, tons of ripe cherries lay wasted on the ground. Meanwhile, in California, entire fields of fresh greens remain untouched as market buyers and processing companies cancel contracts, citing uncertain demand and rising costs. Farmers watch as their produce spoils under the summer sun, with no labor force to gather it or buyers to take it. For American consumers, especially those living paycheck to paycheck, these disruptions have had a painful impact. Supermarkets across the country have raised cherry and leafy green prices by 25 to 35% in just one season, according to USDA Market News. Many families now face tough choices, whether to buy fresh produce or prioritize medicine and other essentials. Food pantries in states like Oregon and Nevada report a 40% increase in requests for vegetables, as more Americans struggle to afford the basics. Looking to the coming months, Agricultural economists forecast that produce prices may remain elevated or even rise further, especially if labor shortages continue. Unless immigration and labor policies adapt or new harvesting technologies are introduced, the gap between what's grown in American fields and what makes it to American tables could widen, putting additional strain on vulnerable households. Canada has rapidly climbed to the top ranks of global wheat exporters, shipping out an impressive 26.2 million tons in 2023 and holding the number 2 spot worldwide, according to Agri-Food Canada. As American export contracts decline, Canadian grain increasingly fills the gap in both U.S. and international markets. Supermarkets and food manufacturers are turning to Canadian imports, which are seen as more reliable and competitively priced. This shift brings new concerns for U.S. consumers. When stores and restaurants rely more on Canadian imports, Americans lose access to homegrown wheat and grains, and may see more dramatic swings in prices as the global market shifts. Made in USA labels are becoming rarer in grocery aisles, causing concern for those who prioritize domestic production for reasons of freshness, food security, or national pride. For rural communities, the decline in exports hits hard, threatening local jobs and eroding the base of family-owned farms. Industry analysts warn that this new balance could become permanent. If the U.S. cannot regain its foothold in global markets, the country may depend more heavily on foreign supply, leaving consumers vulnerable to international price spikes and policy changes. Some experts suggest this is a wake-up call to invest in local agriculture and rebuild America's reputation for quality and reliability. Behind these struggles lies a combination of labor shortages, rising costs, and slipping international trust. Seasonal farm labor has dwindled sharply as immigration policies tighten and fear of enforcement by ICE keeps workers away. According to the American Farm Bureau Federation, nearly 60% of fruit and vegetable farms report an acute shortage of pickers this year, resulting in millions of dollars in lost produce. At the same time, the cost of farming has soared. Federal subsidies and crop insurance payouts have not kept pace, leaving farmers exposed to financial risk. On the global stage, America's position has eroded as buyers lose faith in U.S. suppliers. Canada, by contrast, has earned customer trust with consistent delivery, strict international packaging standards, including QR code tracking, refrigerated shipping, and ESG certification that U.S. farms often lack. For U.S. shoppers, this translates to growing unease about the quality, traceability, and safety of domestic products. Whether it's salad greens or steak, projections for the rest of 2024 and beyond are sobering. Without reform, farm groups predict more American crops will be lost in the field, and more market share will shift overseas. Experts urge investment in new technology, streamlined immigration rules, and stricter quality standards to restore trust. Until then, consumers may find themselves questioning the origin and quality of everyday foods. Experts forecast continued volatility in food prices and availability as farms struggle with labor, costs, and competition. It's a critical moment for American families to stay informed and consider supporting local producers whenever possible. In a single tweet, President Trump announced the immediate suspension of all trade talks with Canada over its digital services tax. And he didn't stop there. He threatened a 25% retaliatory tariff on auto parts. So how much more will you be paying for brake pads or tires next month? On June 27, 2025, President Trump announced via Twitter that the United States would immediately terminate all trade negotiations with Canada in response to Canada's newly imposed 3% digital services tax, DST, on U.S. technology firms. He characterized Canada's move as an economic act of hostility and warned that Washington would unveil retaliatory tariffs within the next 7 days. This decision reflects internal political pressure on the Trump administration, from voters concerned that American tech companies are dodging taxes in foreign markets. As early as next week, the U.S. Department of Commerce is likely to launch an investigation under Section 301, paving the way for 25 to 50% duties on Canadian steel, aluminum, and auto parts. In turn, Ottawa may suspend or repeal its DST to restart talks, an approach it has previously used with the European Union. Canada supplies roughly 10% of U.S. oil imports. Additional tariffs could raise gasoline prices in northern states, like Michigan and New York, by 2 to 3 cents per liter. Retaliatory duties on auto parts, which account for 25% of Canada's auto exports, could push the cost of brake replacements, tires, and repair services up by 3 to 5%, directly impacting household budgets. Although the DST targets companies like Google and Meta, halting negotiations may lead these firms to reconsider online advertising rates for small American businesses, indirectly raising marketing costs for local shops. On June 30th, 2025, the Government of Canada announced it would completely repeal the planned 3% digital services tax, which had been set to take effect on January 1st, 2022. This move is intended to revive stalled trade discussions with the United States after President Trump's June 27th announcement. According to a statement from Canada's Department of Finance, collections scheduled for June 30th would be suspended, and legislation to abolish the DST will be tabled in Parliament in July. Canada aims to balance fiscal interests with the priority of stabilizing bilateral economic relations. In the short term, Ottawa is expected to propose a multilateral solution through the OECD framework instead of a unilateral measure, thereby easing U.S. pressure while preserving the right to tax digital platforms under global fair taxation principles. Ahead of the G7 summit on July 21, 2025, in Kananaskis, Canada may leverage the forum to advocate for a multinational technology tax agreement. Before the repeal, firms such as Google and Meta were required to allocate 3% of ad revenue related to Canada. Abolishing the tax will spare small businesses and startups from a 3% increase in marketing expenses, helping to stabilize digital ad prices. The DST could have forced tech companies to cut approximately 3,000 positions in Canada due to sudden operational cost hikes. Its removal will help sustain jobs in tech hubs like Toronto and Vancouver. Leaders from both countries are expected to announce a new negotiation schedule next week, aiming for a framework agreement before the G7 summit on July 21st. Canada's flexibility may pave the way for an expanded trade pact, including adjustments to tariffs on steel, aluminum, and auto parts. On July 3, 2025, Reuters reported that Canada's merchandise trade deficit in May narrowed to 5.9 billion Canadian dollars, down from 7.6 billion Canadian dollars in April, largely thanks to a 1.1% rise in exports and a 1.6% drop in imports month over month. Notably, exports to the U.S., which account for about 75% of total trade, fell by 0.9% for the fourth consecutive month, marking their lowest level since 2020. Canada is temporarily curbing imports from the U.S. to rebalance its trade ledger amid tariff uncertainty. In the near term, Ottawa may continue easing imports of non-sensitive American goods, such as essential agricultural products, while seeking new partners in Asia and the EU. On the U.S. side, if tariff tensions persist, additional safeguard measures could emerge by the end of Q3 to protect domestic industries. U.S. companies in border states, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, reliant on Canadian auto parts and machinery orders, face the risk of lost contracts, production disruptions, and potential layoffs. Farmers and food processors exporting to Canada may scale back output due to reduced orders, affecting family incomes and rural community livelihoods. While prices for many Canadian imports may stabilize due to lower volumes, the cost of replacing supplies from Europe or Asia could push up prices for certain products. such as grains and powdered milk, in the medium term, influencing household living expenses. In July, Canada and the US are set to hold ministerial-level talks on long-term solutions. Ottawa may announce incentives to boost imports from alternative markets, while Washington considers easing some retaliatory tariffs to restore bilateral trade flows. Data from May 2025 show that both Canadian exports to and imports from the US have declined, while trade volumes with other markets, particularly the EU and Asia, have reached record highs. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly has emphasized that Canada cannot rely solely on the US and must diversify its partners to ensure long-term economic security. Reduced exports to Canada will directly impact workers in states such as Michigan and New York, prompting many small suppliers, especially in the automotive and wood processing industries, to consider scaling back production. American consumers may see fewer Canadian specialty products, like certain cheeses and dairy items, and face higher prices when substituting European or Asian alternatives. In Q4 2025, the two governments are expected to convene a high-level diplomatic summit to discuss a new preferential tariff mechanism aimed at both preserving North American supply chains and reflecting the global trend toward trade diversification.